Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rehana. Thank you so much again for all the feedback coming through this week on YouTube, all the feedback and all the new subscribers joining us this week. We are one away from 100, which we are very excited about. We being me and my daughter. If you're not already subscribed, please do so. There's so many of you that are watching, whether it's the shorts on YouTube or the full episode that are not actually subscribed. It really helps me grow the channel and continue to do this for longer. Last week, we ended with the Cape Qualified franchise of 1853, and we took that all the way to its conclusion, I guess, in 1910. But now we're going to track back to the next act that followed post the Cape Qualified franchise, which was introduced as the foundation for racial control. So that's what we're going to follow through this week. And hopefully next week we'll get into where the segregation becomes more institutionalized. There's a lot of laws and legislation that was passed to get the country primed for what was coming when apartheid hit. There's a lot for us to go through. There's a ton of people that I'm reading about and very excited to tell you about. So please follow on as we continue. Before we get into the episode, there's one thing I wanted to mention. So I made the bonkers decision to go to the Labour Department, the Department of Home Affairs, and the bank all in one day. Guys, don't know. There's a couple of observations from my side. One, the buildings are horrible. Awful, horrible. They are cleaning staff. They're really trying to, as much as possible, keep things clean, make sure it's neat, but it needs a little sprucing up. Two, the people that are sitting in these situations, and if you have a young child or if you are elderly, the preference is for them to help you first. They make a concerted effort to do that. The interactions, the camaraderie, the wanting to help each other was really heartwarming to see. People strike up a conversation, they come and sit next to you, and watching other people interact with each other, not only with me, was really, really heartwarming. Then the staff. Thank you so much. You guys work in conditions that is not great. Okay, let's go with that. But you guys are so kind, helping everybody, making sure everybody is taken care of. This one lady was phoning an elderly gentleman's work. She said, please wait there. I'm going to sort you out. I'll phone your work. She then took my paper. She said, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to check your application, but you're in the wrong place. I'm going to take you to the next place. And if it's too long, I'll try to get you in front. So I said, no, it's not a problem. She said, you'll have to queue again. I'm so sorry. And I said, that doesn't matter. It's fine. She took me there. She was like, am I walking too fast? I'm like, no, you're great. Thank you. And at Home Affairs, the other thing I noticed, not so much from the Labour Department, but from Home Affairs, was that the system is not efficient. These ladies and gentlemen are trying their best. They're trying to get you what you need. Make sure you get in and out of there as quickly as possible. They really want that for you. They kept mentioning it. The one lady is like, who took my pen now? Or who did this? These people are waiting to leave and we're making them wait long. I found that amazing. So thank you so much to the employees at the Department of Labour and the Department of Home Affairs in Cape Town, around Barrack Street. You guys were fantastic. The wait outside, not that fantastic, but you know, I applaud you. You guys are doing the most. And I appreciated it as much as I was irritated being there that long. I have nothing to be irritated about. These people are doing it with a smile on their face, and they're trying to get us in and out of here as soon as possible. Even the bank, she was so sweet. She's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm waiting for these people to mail me back. I can't really do anything. Are you okay to sit here? Do you want to go do something else? And then you come, guys. I have worked with highly paid, highly skilled individuals in my technologist life, and not a lot of them do what they do with a smile on their face as these people did today. And it was just amazing. I'm waxing lyrically about it, but it really was that impactful for me being there today and feeling that and seeing them doing what they do day in, day out, smile on their face, helping each other and helping you. So thank you so much. Getting back to today's episode, I'm going to take you through some of these acts. I'm going to try and explain what they were, what happened. Today I'm focusing in on one law or act that was passed, and then I'll talk about two very impactful individuals from a colored community perspective here in the Cape. The reason why I'm focusing into the 1894 Glen Grey Act is because it's one of the most important stepping stones, not in a good way, of laws in South African history. It's often overshadowed by the apartheid legislation, but it set the groundwork for segregation in both land ownership and labor control. And it also touched the colored community in meaningful ways. The reason I'm making that separation is because the law really first targeted Africans, and that I mean Black South Africans. I'm going to be using Africans in reference to Black South Africans just because it's easier to say, but that's what I mean when I say that, just as a shorter word for me to use. This act was introduced in the Cape Colony by Cecil John Rhodes. It aimed at solving what Rhodes called the native question, i.e., how to control African land use, labor, and political power. Though officially formed as land reform, the true purpose was to push Africans and to some extent coloreds into wage labor markets for white-owned farms, mines, and industries. So there were key provisions to this act. One was land ownership restrictions. Africans could only hold land in individual tenure, not communal systems, which is generally how tribes function. Right? Plots were small, 4 acres, so it was too little for self-sustaining farming. Land could not be subdivided or sold, limiting accumulation of wealth. We're not going to talk about that. Some of this land was originally these people. Labor tax was the next one. 10 shilling annual tax was imposed on men not working for wages. Those are landowners, business owners. So this was designed to force men into the labor market rather than subsistence farming, pushing them out of owning their own land, building their own way to make money, and then they can't sell that. Great. The next one was their political rights were removed. Africans living under the Glen Grey Act areas were denied voting rights in the Cape, even if they remember the Cape franchise, even if they met the property or education qualifications that allowed some participation before. So you see that constricting, it's control, but it is to restrict. I don't want to use the news thing. Okay. Obviously, there was a resistance to this from the Africans and the coloreds. There were times they came together and they aligned on resisting this, but they obviously individually also did their own things. From an African resistance perspective, traditional leaders opposed the erosion of communal land systems. That's how they work. Chiefs and headmen from the Eastern Cape attended meetings and hearings and submitted petitions against the act. Some chiefs tried to delay or block its implementation in their districts by refusing cooperation with surveyors and tax collectors. Petitions and protests were raised in the Cape Parliament by African representatives. Certain chiefs voiced their opposition through African through African representatives, such as John Tengo Jabavu and Walter Rubusana. And I'll give you some detail about them later. They also refused to pay taxes, which occurred in some districts. Then from a colored perspective, the colored farmers and laborers were like, hold a minute, especially in rural Eastern Cape and Northern Cape. They were like, feels like this is coming our way. So they feared that they would eventually get the same restrictions. Colored political voices in the Cape franchise system oppose erosion of common role rights, seeing it as a warning of future disenfranchisement. So they really did see the writing on the wall. So as I said, this was mainly aimed at Africans, but it really felt that it was coming our way. There was an impact for the colored community, even though the law targeted Africans. By pushing Africans off land, the act reinforced the power of white landowners, which also squeezed colored smallholders in the Cape who competed for farmland. The forced migration of African workers into mines and farms put downward pressure on wages, affecting colored farm workers and artisans. Colored leaders in the Cape saw this act as a test case, right? We spoke about if they come for them, they're coming for us next. They saw this as a test case for disenfranchisement. Indeed, similar strategies were later used and applied to strip colored people of the Cape franchise. They did see this coming. I spoke last week about the mission stations and how they used this to kind of separate and create a hierarchy between colored people and Africans. With this act, Rhodes and others set Africans apart legally while temporarily leaving coloreds with partial rights in the Cape, planting seeds of racial division. Like I said, the same intent as the mission stations, but it was temporary, but it became so ingrained, right? Let's talk about the proponents for this act. I'm not going to give them much airtime, but there's enough history about these men out there. And there was Cecil John Rhodes with his very great native question. He was the Prime Minister of the Cape and the architect of the act. He believed that Africans should be forced into labor rather than independent farming. He famously said, the natives are to be treated as a child and denied franchise. We must adopt a system of despotism. Gem of a human, as you can see. Then we had James Rose Innes, who was a Liberal Cape politician. Although more moderate, he supported the principle of pushing Africans into wage labor. I always wonder why. Because y'all couldn't do the work yourself, or y'all didn't want to do that kind of work. The opponents of the act, we spoke about John Tenga Jabavu, who was an African journalist and activist. He was the editor of South Africa's first newspaper to be completely in Xhosa. He initially supported the act because he thought that it would secure a place for Africans and a vote in the new parliamentary system. But then he realized, wait a minute, that it was enforcing segregation and disempowering Black communities. He just saw it as a way to destroy that, which he thought it was going to give them. Right? Then we had Walter Rabusana, who was also co-founder of a Xhosa language newspaper publication. So both newspaper guys, and he was just opposed to the erosion of the African voting rights. Traditional leaders obviously came in, they didn't want to pay the tax. They resisted individual land tenure. And then we had colored voices in the Cape, which is local farm communities and political associations warned about the coloreds being next. The long-term significance, and I spoke about this earlier, that this became a prototype for later segregation laws. This was definitely the feeling out stage. How much resistance would we get? How much could we get away with? And clearly they got away with enough that it emboldened them to go through to the next phase of segregation, or the next set of laws that was going to make that completely clear. It introduced the principle that land dispossession and labor coercion could be enshrined in law, as it marked the beginning of systematic disenfranchisement, first of Africans and later extended to coloreds. You look at these moments and divisions it caused between the people of color in this country, it was purposed and diabolical. Look at the modern context of this. Look at what is happening over the sea. That way, this way, that way, whichever way you look, there's some form of this happening. The narrative I see from people who are currently fighting this out in the world is that if they come for us, they will come for you next, and then move from there. No one is safe. That should have been the lesson learned from history, right? I watch them sometimes. They're like, oh, great. This person says they'll get rid of that person. So I'll vote for you and I'll give you power. And then they don't realize they are the next person on the list. And you wonder, like, how do they not see that? So then they become the next person on the list and they're like, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. There's this never-ending need to grab land, money, and power as much as they can from people and use the division that they've ingrained in them to get them put into power, and then they'll use it against them. Don't be confused and don't be mistaken. And that was done here to us as a people. And when I say us as a people, I'm meaning the whole spectrum of non-white South Africans. Okay. So this was the stepping stone. While it was initially only done for Africans, it was never only meant for them. It set the tone for structural racial segregation. For the colored community, it was a warning shot, which some of them saw and others didn't. If you weren't paying attention post-emancipation, it was basically, we coming for you. Okay, so let's talk about the next significant historical event was the formation of the African Political Organization. I'm really trying to follow this in a timeline, but sometimes it might jump this, 18 something, then we go to 90. I'm really trying to follow it in the timeline that I've put together and then put the meat around it. The formation of the African Political Organization. What happened? The APO became the main organized political voice of the colored community in the Cape. Dr. Abdullah Abdurahman, who's the president from 1905, was the dominant colored political leader in the first half of the 20th century and led delegations to London to protest the designs of the union and defend the Cape franchise. And we'll speak about the union in the next episode. So what was the impact? Slowed or contested some measures and provided an organized forum for colored civic life. But it also faces structural limits. Union politics and white majoritarian design limited what the APO could secure. As much as they tried, they were kind of hitting walls because there were certain places they couldn't get into. There were certain things they couldn't get right because of who they were. But still, they established a political tradition and leadership and channeled colored grievances into civic campaign rather than individual survival strategies. They say we are stronger together rather than going out there as one human. Let's talk about Abdullah Abdurahman, Dr. Abdullah Abdurahman. He was the first colored city councillor and powerful advocate for the South African colored community. He was born in Wellington in the Cape Colony in 1872 into a middle-class Muslim family. He attended local mission schools and then traveled to Glasgow, Scotland to study medicine. What an opportunity. Exposure in Britain shaped his belief in liberal ideals, racial equality, and civic rights, which he then carried back home. He returned to the Cape as a medical doctor, respected professional, and deeply connected to his community. In 1904, he was elected as the first colored member of the Cape Town City Council. In 1905, he became the president of the African Political Organization. Abdurahman transformed the APO into a national voice, not just central to the Cape. He published the APO newspaper, he campaigned for equal education, and he defended the Cape qualified franchise against attempt to erode it. He led delegations to London in 1906 and 1909, pleading with the British government to protect coloured rights under the creation of the Union of South Africa. This is a quote. He says, "The government says we are not ready for equality, but how can one prepare for freedom except for living it?" He secured improvement in schools for coloured children. Trafalgar High School, 1912, was Cape Town's first secondary school for coloured pupils, and that was one of his successes. He served in the Cape Town City Council for nearly 30 years, influencing housing, health, and municipal services for disenfranchised communities. He advocated for coloured participation in public service and politics, keeping civic visibility alive even as rights were stripped away nationally. He worked with African and Indian leaders at times, though his politics often leaned towards moderate constitutional protest. So with every hero, there is some criticism. As you can see, knowing where we end up with, you look at how he approached it and you kind of go, was that really enough? And we can all ask these questions in hindsight, but we weren't there. I think that when someone believes that you can speak to a person's heart, you can speak to a person's logic and intellect, that you could turn them around. But I think the difference here is that when someone feels a certain way about another group and that's ingrained in their person, a lot of the time there's not much you can say to turn that around. So that was one of his criticism. He trusted his appeals to the British and constitutional methods, even as white supremacist policies hardened. Young radicals in the 90s saw him as out of touch with the working class struggles. And for all that, I think if you come out with a voice of violence, you met with violence and nobody's really listening, right? There is a way to approach these things so that you are listened to, that your people's voices still being heard by you. And you see this many different approaches from many different people, right? Over our lifetime, we'll see that. And I think you can pair the two together, but it's a real leader who understands and is measured and understand what is needed when. Get where I'm coming from? While he was very measured in his approach and he never leaned towards forceful resistance, he kept colored voices in the political conversation during an era of shrinking space. So while we were being silenced, because he was so measured, people were still willing to listen to him. This is another quote. "In a time when others were silenced, even moderation was a form of resistance." What's his impact and legacy? He laid the groundwork for colored civic leadership that inspired later figures like Sissy Gool, who was his daughter, the Teachers League of South Africa, and eventually organizations of the anti-apartheid struggle. His push for schools empowered generations of colored South Africans who would later fuel both professional classes and radical political movements. While he could not stop the tide of segregation and franchise erosion, he kept resistance alive and in the public eye and gave colored people a leader who stood proudly on the national stage. Dr. Abdullah Abdurahman died in 1940, just as South Africa stood on the edge of even deeper racial division. Yet his life tells us something crucial, that leadership is not only about victory, but about refusing to disappear. For over 3 decades, he gave a voice to a community that the state sought to silence. His legacy reminds us that the struggle of for dignity is built step by step, speech by speech, school by school, until the day true freedom comes. So he set us with a foundation that we could then grow from and fight. Then there's one other person that I want to end this episode with, who is Harold Greasy. And when I was doing my read through, I was like, Greasy, from a movie, the Denzel Washington movie. Who was Harold? Harold Greasy was born in 1889 in Rock Drift, Natal, a place already famous in colonial law for a British Zulu battle. But Greasy's story wasn't about war, it was about education. His father, a school principal, believed deeply in the power of knowledge, and Harold absorbed that lesson. He studied at the Zonnebloem College and later pushed his way into the South African College, which today is known as UCT, University of Cape Town. At that time, higher education was the preserve of whites. For colored students, the doors were bolted shut. But Harold persisted, and in 1910, he became the first colored person to graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in South Africa. What a crown to hold. Armed with his degree, Greasy turned not to personal gain but to community upliftment. In 1912, he became the principal of Trafalgar High School in District 6, Cape Town. Imagine this, a young man in his early 20s, already leading an institution that would educate generations of leaders, artists, and activists. Greasy wasn't just a teacher, he was a symbol, a living reminder that education could break down walls for racial prejudice. But Greasy's influence wasn't limited to the classroom. He joined forces with Dr. Abdullah Abdurahman in the APO as the group secretary and as a writer for the APO newspaper we spoke about earlier. Here he sharpened his voice against injustice. He spoke against past laws, against the deliberate underfunding of colored schools, against the creeping tide of segregation. At the time when South African laws were being written to exclude, Greasy used his words, education, and organization to push back. His success in higher education challenged white supremative's narrative and gave confidence to colored and African students. Sadly, Harold Greasy's life was cut short. In 1916, at the young age of 27, died of pneumonia. But his impact did not fade. Trafalgar High School continued as a hub of colored intellectual life. Decades later, during apartheid, it was a center of student resistance. In 1953, another school, Harold Greasy High School, was named in his honor. It became a symbol of defiance against apartheid education, carrying forward his vision that learning could be liberation. Harold Greasy's life embodied the intersection of education and activism. For the colored community, he became a proof point that excellence could break through systemic racism. For South Africa more broadly, he helped establish the intellectual and organizational foundation for late anti-apartheid resistance. His story is a reminder that change isn't always measured in decades of activism. Sometimes it's about what you do with the time you have. In his short life, he opened doors that others thought would never budge. And by doing so, he inspired the movement that saw education not just as knowledge, but as power. That was great. What are the lessons we can learn from Harold Greasy and Dr. Abdullah Abdurahman? Greasy fought for the equal access to quality education for colored South Africans. Investing in knowledge equips community to challenge opposition and oppression. As the first colored person to earn a BA at the University of Cape Town, he exemplified the power of perseverance in overcoming systemic obstacles. Greasy showed that leadership can be rooted in service. Educators and community leaders can spark social transformation through example and advocacy. Then, the Abdullah Abdurahman. As a member of the Cape Town City Council and the African Political Organization, he demonstrated that formal political participation can be leveraged to defend marginalized communities. Rahman's lifelong fight against disenfranchisement illustrate that social change is often slow and requires sustained effort. He worked across racial and political lines when possible, highlighting the importance of coalition building for effective advocacy. You're very inspiring too, man. And next week we get to speak about his daughter. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, for engaging online. Remember to please like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know how you are feeling about the episodes. I really appreciate all the feedback, and yeah, let's keep this train going as we go deeper into our history. Thank you so much for listening. Please come back next week and I'll see you then. Bye. I don't wanna fight no more.